Major MVPs are incredibly important. They can make and break your season. Break not so much, but you understand, missing out on that MVP. Hell, if you're one of the all-time great players, winning a major and not receiving the MVP can be seen as a bit of a question mark. Not necessarily diminishing who you were overall, but maybe calling into question exactly how you won your titles. The major MVP is critical in that sense, and we're going to go through all of the Valve-sponsored major MVPs. I'm not going to try and go back into 1.6 and Source and see what actually counts as a major and who actually... I wasn't watching. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to pretend to know that history very well. If you want to find out about those things, go ask Thorin. That's not my area of expertise. We're going to get into the Valve major MVPs, which ones are the best, which ones are the most dominant, and we're going to do it in 3 different ways. I'm going to show you exactly the players I have. Up here you see there's a couple of coldzeras. It's alphabetical, obviously. That's why it's listed like this, but you've got the coldzeras, the devices, donk, a couple of Fnatic players littered about, a nice variety from them. But of course some Astralis boys. It's a pretty impressive list of pretty much every all-time great with some notable exceptions. We're going to break them down on mostly these 3 sort of categories. Firstly, their individual dominance, how fantastic they were as a player. So I've always had a certain philosophy in terms of what you need to be able to do as an individual to be an impressive MVP, or just to be an MVP in the first place. You have to put up numbers. The second part is just how much help you receive. If you have a teammate who drops near identical numbers to you, your entire team drops a 126 and you're up there at a 127, you get the MVP, how valuable were you? You're not as valuable. You're still doing very impressive things, fully earned your sort of title in that sense. That's why, there's no, straight diss tier. It's just some MVPs will be seen as a little bit weaker, be seen as more of a team effort. Not all of them are going to be rampant, dominant runs of individual dominance. So in those 2 things. And the third thing is who you faced. Majors are famous for their upsets, thanks in no small part to Valve's terrible formatting, so we're going to have to take that into consideration in terms of who they played, especially in that playoff run. I think if you manage to win a major whilst avoiding all the big dogs of your current sort of era, if you make it through a top 8 bracket facing number 10, number 11, and then finally the grand final number 6 in the world, it's going to be less impressive than the number 1 team who played the number 2 team, the number 3 team, and the number 4 team just to get their major. So all of that's going to come into consideration. Let's begin with a Fnatic MVP. JW, the first MVP in CS Valve major history, and a really interesting team to look back upon. Flusha would then go out, after this event, and with majors that followed, Flusha would carve out this legacy of being a major dominant player. JW was a part of this select crop of AWPers who was just ultra aggressive, combative, dominant though, really fast, flick heavy, impactful players, and he led his team to this title. He was the most impressive player on this roster, and he won it fairly deservedly. Look at his individual numbers. He outperforms the rest of his team quite comfortably. It's not like he doesn't have any help, we have to admit. Flusha played really well. Schneider played a surprisingly good event for a guy who kind of disappears after that into sort of the rest of the history of CS. It's a more interesting story than I think just the event page would indicate when it comes to Schneider. I think someone worth looking into. But on the team, there was also Devilwalk and Pronax, who contributed very little when it came to the actual individual fragging, but were rather leaders, support players, would go on to make coaches, and Pronax would go on to win more majors as an IGL. It was a balanced team. It had its support pieces, had its clear 3 stars. JW shone the brightest. Don't think I can put him much higher than a solid MVP, though. Some of the numbers we're going to see from other players in this sort of video are going to be ridiculous, and whilst JW was incredibly strong, I don't think it was quite up there. Plus, given the fact that the team had multiple really hard carry players throughout this playoff and some great performances in the big games by big game players like Flusha, puts a bit of a ceiling on it, but it's a fantastic start. I mean, an incredible run in terms of the opposition faced in the grand final, facing the near invincible NIP and getting that win. I mean, does a final opponent in the major get any tougher than that? I genuinely don't think so. Though, to be fair, that NIP team, whilst after this point would lose a bit of its luster, having not won that championship, and they wouldn't feel complete until they did win that major. They would continue to just be the final opponent everyone faced for 5 majors straight, including the one they win. So yeah, Fnatic beat the team to beat in that sense, just to win it. Could have been a tougher bracket overall, perhaps. Could have had a tougher group. There were some questions about that, but realistically for me, this Fnatic team were an upstart, surprise team. They did face some tough opposition. JW was impactful. It's a really good baseline. If you go outperforming this JW, it makes sense to put you above him. If you didn't, then yeah, realistically you have to be given a bit of a less generous rating. Now, the second major of Counter-Strike history, the second Valve-sponsored major in Counter-Strike history, is a very important one. It's one that really shaped sort of the viewer base, the fan base, like what jerseys you see at every single sort of big event. The fact that realistically, pretty much everyone who's like in the UK and a fan of Counter-Strike who came up around this time, because this was when the scene really was exploding and expanding, the player base, you know, before the first major to after like the second or third major went from what, like 100k to 1 million plus players. Like, it's a massive point of like cultural importance in terms of the viewership and the fans of Counter-Strike. And that's why we have so many Virtus Pro fans, I think, around the planet for a long time who were not Polish in them, you know, in their own right. They had nothing to do with Poland, but they'd watched this Virtus Pro team win a major, dominate, have all this sort of cultural impact, as it were, as the Virtus plow. And the man who received the MVP at that win was PashaBiceps. Now, looking at their run, it doesn't get tough till the grand final. Like, it doesn't get particularly tough until you get to the grand final. Now, the LGB team they beat in the semi-finals would go on to be a more important player in history than we ever expected, housing Dennis and Crims and Olof, guys who would go on to play on Fnatic. I mean, Olof and Crims arriving, then winning back-to-back majors, Dennis arriving and leading them to the 6 straight LAN titles that, well, shocked the world, created a dominant monster, but then also kind of set the stage for other teams to take over, because it was a short-lived burst, but it then kind of nerfed the team overall and led to a whole other mess that we're going to get into, I'm sure, later in this video. But yeah, in the grand final, they do play an IP. They win 2-0. Pasha, he's the highest-rated player at the event for the team overall. The whole team gets rolling. Snacks has a monster grand final. Bialy is honestly a phenom just the entire way through on the entries. Just a dirty player, that boy. When he was on, he was so on. So I think, for me, Pasha kind of has to go into the team effort here. Everyone firing on all cylinders on this roster. They are fantastic, but he is not separating himself from the field to quite the extent I would have liked. As an individual, you could say he probably played better than JW, especially in terms of the numbers, how the performances were statistically recorded. It's just that in the playoffs, you know, his teammates outperforming him. He plays a relatively weak field. I think I'd actually have to put it down to team effort. Like, it's a team effort. You're the best on the team. That's clear. We're giving you that credit. Still a fantastic run, a historic run, and especially as a team, this created one hell of a legacy. I mean, they dined out on this for a long time, but also it sort of set up the style, the plow. This was the first time we saw it come into action. I mean, in that grand final against NIP, they didn't drop a map to NIP. Like, that's crazy at that time. Like, they just rolled through 2-0. A really impressive run. It feels, you know, I feel bad about any of the decisions I'm making here, because I'm splitting hairs. I'm actually not even going to do it. It feels so bad. I'm going to put him up to solid MVP. Screw it. Sorry. I talked my way out of it. I just, you know, expressed what I was feeling, and it didn't quite reflect what I was seeing. Like, in terms of what I'd done something wrong. I had to correct it. He's a solid MVP as well. Just could have been higher, especially given his actual just output. 0.91 KPR. Fantastic for an entire event. Just the weakness of the field. The teammates also just cruising and crushing. He has to be a solid MVP for me. Can't be a top dog, and certainly isn't a one-man army. Right, at this point, we reach the part of history where NIP finally get it done. They complete what was destined. They take home what was always really in our minds. When you think back to this period, you think about the way they dominated 2012, 2013, you know, the levels we saw out of players like Kjaerbye and Forest. You know, they finally got the title that made it all make sense. But Friberg takes the MVP, and no one saw that coming. I mean, you watch the event, and it makes sense at the end of the day when you know, just that one event in isolation. But going into the major, if I told you NIP are going to win this major, the MVP will not be Forest. It will not be Kjaerbye. It'll be Friberg, the third best player on the team, and not exactly a weak player, but just, you know, not the one you'd expect, really. But yeah, a really interesting run. They face in these playoffs an LDLC side that on paper looks like it should be way better than it is, but in reality really struggled until they, well, struggled to put it all together and go on and win, at least the org, until they basically changed everyone except Happy. Like, sure, that team would, the core of which would go on to unite with Kenny S at one point and under Titan briefly before Kaylee gets banned, be a fairly dangerous sort of top 8 level team. But again, These aren't the world beaters we're talking about. And then the other team they would play on that playoff run is a Cloud9 team of Hiko and Sean Gares, nothing. You know, one of those OG sort of lovable teams that everyone was a fan of. Like, you know, there's always a Cloud9 roster someone can harken back to and be like, oh, that was my favorite team. It's never because they were actually that good. It's always because they had potential, like unrealized potential, like nothing. You know, we loved him in 1.6, and Hiko was such a legend. He was one of the best North American players we'd ever seen, but it never came together. This playoff appearance for them would be actually an impressive run in itself. They took a map off NIP, future champs, but we didn't see them face, you know, true adversity until they reached that grand final. They shouldn't have faced real adversity. They actually did drop maps to both those teams until they faced in that grand final that Fnatic team that had been freshly upgraded. This wasn't just the Fnatic team that had won a major over NIP back in 2013. This was the Olof and Crims version. This is the version that would go on to win back-to-back majors in the next year. This was a fantastic roster. That's probably the biggest, most important part of this run that really legitimizes it and makes it feel like a huge deal and a difficult mountain to overcome. Is that in the grand final, they face the toughest challenge you could ask for, and they still succeeded. That final map of Inferno would become a thing of legend. Friberg, playmaking left, right, and center, ends up topping the team's sort of rating charts, fragging charts. But it's not a crazy performance. It's not an outlier in terms of individual brilliance. It's not that stunning. It's just he was the best on a good team. I'm going to, for now, place this in team effort, but I'm going to be reviewing some of these as I go through, see how it feels, how it gels, what should be where, because, you know, if there was ever a case for one to be weak, it'd be this one. I don't know why Friberg has ended up completely out of order with everyone else, but for now, team effort for Friberg. An impressive run, a great run for him, but if, relative to other major MVPs, not that statistically stunning. And, you know, they had a tough grand final, but the rest of the opposition, whilst really good, wouldn't be described as, you know, massive title contenders in the same way. The majors would then return to Elmia, to Jönköping, to Sweden for DreamHack Winter 2014. And what would play out would be one of the most controversial major playoffs literally ever. I mean, there's been other controversies. None have ever been as impactful, as decisive as this one. LDLC would win this major. Happy would receive the MVP. But in the quarterfinal, well, those who know their history will know exactly what I'm talking about. Those who don't, just go into that little search bar, type in the Olof boost, and you'll find out really quickly what happened. On paper, when you look at the run they went through, this LDLC side should be nothing but just big green ticks. He faced the Fnatic that we just talked about in the last sort of player MVP as this, you know, ridiculously stacked side. It was a major winning side. They upgrade 2 pieces. How could they have gotten worse? They haven't. They've gotten so much better. But now you have to face them in your quarters. That's your opening playoff game. After that, you play Na'Vi, who've I'm not sure quite how long they'd had Guardian at this point, but this was a sort of dangerous Na'Vi side, like with the leadership from Starix, from Zeus. Edwards fragging on the rifle was still solid enough. Guardian on the AWP was a real sort of impact carry type of AWPer, and they set up their entire game plan around them, around him. It was a tough team to beat. Plus, on top of that, in the grand final, you do face NIP, the perennial major finalists. They're finally starting to look weaker in terms of their sort of their grip around the entire scene. You know, early days, it was just them. Then when you approach the first major, you know, they'd lose the occasional Very Games matchup. By now, it's mostly they're a solid team. They have clutch aspects. They're not quite that sort of level. There's always a chance they'll win the touch. You know, they may be the 3rd best odds at worst. That's who they face in their grand final. So on paper, it's a fantastic run. In practice, the forfeited map win over Fnatic, a map that pretty much everyone who's since looked back on the time period just says it feels crazy that this wasn't just replayed. Or honestly, in an NFL sense, if you've ever watched, the offsetting penalties come into effect and we just leave the result as is. Instead, the forfeit, thanks to a large amount of pressure from the community, comes through, and LDLC are allowed to proceed. And that leaves a black mark. Add to that, Happy's numbers are good. They're good. They're not insane, though. And he was playing on a team that had stacked itself with talent, specifically to do this kind of thing. I mean, adding Kyoshima, who was kind of like a hidden gem, not very well hidden, but at majors would be on weaker French sides, but put up crazy numbers in his own right. alongside MBK, who was, a superstar from 1.6, not 1.6, from Source rather. Shocks, Smiths, a duo that was inseparable. In early go, Smiths was passable and Shocks was a phenom. Like, this was a loaded roster. Happy fragged out, Happy led the way, and they win the major. I'm having a really tough time deciding between team effort and weak for this one. I'm going to leave it in team effort. We'll come back to it. There's an off taste in my mouth talking about that major win. Just a weird part of Counter-Strike history. I'm never quite sure what the right side of it is. Anyway, let's move on. The majors returned to Poland with Katowice, and it was a sort of almost just a classic in terms of who ends up in the top 4. We do actually have the French of Envy, the Swedes of NIP and Fnatic, and Virtus Pro, the Poles. This was a really loaded sort of top 4 in that sense, in terms of just the big names, the big stars. It's kind of unfortunate that Fnatic don't get to play more of them. Like, they just played the semi-final against Virtus Pro and the grand final against NIP, but if you had to draw it up, you'd be like, oh, replace that Penta side with Na'Vi, and you're like, oh, what a run that'd be. But it wasn't quite there. Still a fantastically tough pair of teams to play in terms of the major, especially. These are teams that really show up at majors. And they had to play them back-to-back in Virtus Pro, then NIP. Olofmeister comes out as the MVP, and he's the clear top dog on his team. He's the clear top dog of this event. This is the year he finishes first overall for HLTV top 20. He kind of breaks the meta with his Tech 9 abuse. But this is an Olofmeister who just kind of did it all and came out looking like the guy in Counter-Strike. In terms of the actual stats and the playoff run itself, it's iffy. It doesn't feel like it's that solid in terms of his numbers relative to his team until you get to that grand final where it is Olofmeister versus the world in terms of that matchup with NIP. He does kind of go one-man army for that specific series. He does it for the entire event. Does face a very tough field. I'm going to give Olofmeister a top dog here. This was an incredible run. Tough opposition in the playoffs. Are we approaching the point where we have... No, we're still playing silly little BO1s. I mean, technically they have a BO1 win over Na'Vi in their groups. So if you want to give him that extra credit as well. But we're still a long way from the still imperfect formats we have today for the major. But yeah, at least I think the decider games are at least best of 3s now, right? No, we're still BO1s all the way through. Jesus. Lord, we suffered. Lord, we suffered back then. But Olofmeister, yeah, one of the better runs we've seen so far, both in terms of his individual play and the teams faced, and without any silly little caveats to throw in. Yeah, top dog. What a performance. We then go down to Cologne. Now, this is another sort of now legendary event. Back then was still forging its legacy as major, primarily. And we go again to Fnatic as they win it. And this time it's Flusher who receives the MVP. Now, Flusher's got an interesting case here because they do beat some pretty tough teams. They beat Virtus Pro. They beat Envy in the grand final. And that Envy grand final, I mean, that's the French super team Envy at this point. With Kenny S, with Kyoshima, MBK, Happy, and Apex on top of it. What a ridiculous team to try and face. That death ball was a nightmare. Thankfully, they still hadn't quite figured out everything. They were still a bit tactically unsound, but they hadn't, they weren't in their final form. They would be eventually. But this Fnatic side, took care of business against them. Faced the budding Luminosity side, who were a couple of role moves away. Role players changes away from being, in their own right, one of the greatest teams we ever watched. But overall, the weakness is a bit clearer here. In terms of the teams they face, it's not quite as impressive as their prior run. But also, quite importantly, Flusher gets more help from his team than Olofmeister did just before. So I think Flusher, he showed up in the playoffs. You have to give him that. He was top-rated in the grand final, the semi-final. Really played well in the quarterfinal as well, even if Olof might get a nod in terms of rating at least. Tough to pick between sort of top dog and solid for this Flusher run. I mean, he pumps numbers. He puts out a crazy performance. As far as for a player who's more clutch based, who's late round, the closing. Yeah, I'm going to talk myself into it. I'm going to put him in top dog alongside Olofmeister. These two were bloody crazy at majors in 2015. And as much as he did have more help than, say, Olof did, or potentially some other players we're going to talk about, the way he played and the fact that he was able to do it from these clutch positions, absolutely insane. The opposition was tough. This is a really good run. Okay, we come to probably the toughest one of these for me to be objective about. for me to be realistic about. It's Envious' major win, with Kenny S as the major MVP. Kenny S, you know, the player who got me into Pro CS, basically, watching his frag movies, watching his highlights, sold me on the game. Like, I remember first talking to my friends when we booted up Counter-Strike, like, for not even the first time, but I think, like, some first to fifth, like, somewhere in that range. Like, barely started playing the game. And I was like, the major just happened, and NIP, Ninjas in Pajamas won. You know, it's around that era. And at this point, Kenny S is not on this level of team. He's, you know, stuck in Titan, essentially. But the frag movies. Oh, the frag movies. He was on Clan Mystic, I think, for some of that. But, yeah. Became my favourite players. The only player I've asked for a picture from. Like, he is that guy to me. But let's talk about this run. Let's try and be objective. They beat Fnatic in the quarterfinal. They then play G2. This is when G2 was just transitioned from Gamers 2 into G2. It's the first true international super team attempt. It's a really odd roster. Thinking back, it's like Fox, Michaelele, Rain. Had some really talented players, and Rain has a fantastic sort of highlight, I think, from that game specifically on Cash. Not exactly one of the world beaters, not one of the teams you expect to be up there at this point. And then in the grand final, they play Na'Vi, who are really still the same team we talked about 2 or 3 majors ago. Just keep trying it, keep plugging away. I think at this point they have Flamey, though, right? Yeah, at this point they also have Flamey. So not just Seized, who's really good for his roles, not just Guardian, who's an amazing carry job AWPer, but they also have really, really talented rifle play coming in. Flamey's career would go on to not quite burn as bright as we'd hoped, but still a pretty impressive run in that sense in terms of the teams faced. G2 is a bit of a blip as far as not that impressive, but they were fun and they were dangerously skilled. Like, just G2 being G2, I guess. As far as NES's numbers, they're nothing special overall. He's top-rated in the semi-final, top-rated by a good chunk in the grand final as well, played fantastically against Na'Vi in that game, the head-to-head to Guardian being very important as well. So I can keep him a little higher than perhaps some of the other, like, just raw stats would show. But yeah, I have to be a bit more realistic with where I place Kenny S here. On top of everything else, this MV team does go like 5 deep. Like, all the riflers showed up, fragged out, had good ratings, good fragging numbers. When you watch them play, like, sure, Kenny S played a really crucial part in terms of being set up certain openers, closing certain rounds. But mostly that group of rifles, like, oh my god, like the entry trio, the lurker, everything was on point for this team. That's why when they got it right, they were so dangerous. They could win these events with very little resistance. I have to put him in team effort. He was still the MVP. He still put up the best numbers. He still, played his best in the grand final against a very tough opponent. He gets all that credit. But this was a team effort MVP. Like, he was the best of a great team. We now come to the first of 2 Brazilian majors. Now, this is, at this point, we've changed from 3 majors in the year down to 2. And the first one will be MLG Columbus. And this was a pretty strong proposition from coldzera. Like, it's one of the most devastating majors for me. It's at this point like a really big fan of Simple's game, loving what I was seeing. Roll the clip, you all know it. But he faced in his run Virtus Pro, who was still like a top 5 team in the world. This Liquid with Simple, who when they added Simple, didn't play like they were ranked relatively low in HLTV ranking at this point, but they'd added, for my money, the most talented player in the world at that point. In the conversation for best, like 6 months later, like they had taken a huge leap in terms of their ability to win big matches. It's a far more dangerous opposition, or opponent rather, than the actual ranking would suggest. Then in that grand final, they play Na'Vi. Again, a top 5 team, a top 3 team, a contending team, a really tough opponent to go through. And they get it done. coldzera top frags in the quarterfinal, in the semi-final, in the grand final. His rating isn't as high, but that's because you just look at the split, like the overtime Mirage map, he top frags. The blowout overpass that followed, the letdown overpass that follows, he's like 15-5 and like 4th in ranking on the team. Like, his rating is not particularly impressive, but he does end the event with a 0.9 KPR. Like a 1.3 something rating that probably would have been higher had this not been rating 2.0. Like, he was ridiculous in terms of his fragging, in terms of his just raw output. He was a monster at this event. Unstoppable. The Terminator was born, truly. The problem is we do have a good amount of team input. Like, the team do succeed as well alongside him. They put out great numbers. I'm going to put it in solid MVP. Yeah, the fact that the whole roster's just in there, like getting things done, tearing shit up. FNX, one of the best role player performances we've ever seen at a major. For dumpstering teams, Fallen really strong on the AWP. Like Taco's support outperforms expectations. This is a really, really deep and talented LG side. Now we come to Cologne 2016, where we have another coldzera performance, and it does really, like, it boggles the mind to think back on how good he was in these events. But then you always remind yourself, when you look back at the majors specifically, just how much everyone on this team steps up when it comes to a major. I mean, FNX just lives for it. Taco has an absolutely ridiculous run at this event as well. A huge grand final against Liquid. And then Fallen, also up there. Like, this might be the worst Fur major, I think, of the two. And he's still, like, pretty effective. Like, it's kind of a banging team. Like, this is, as far as, like, conversations of great major back-to-back winners, like, great teams, this LGSK sort of period with FNX, my word. They were impossible to stop at these majors. The other thing we have to consider, who they played. Yeah, it's not the greatest list. They did get some. I do think they still run through probably most of the opposition that I'm about to talk about getting knocked out early. But there's no guarantees in this life. And you don't know how you're feeling. Because if instead of, let's say, you enter the grand final having not had to play Flipside in your quarterfinal, who somehow, this is Flipside without Electronic. This is World Edit, Markelov, Waylander type Flipside. That's your quarterfinal. That's a game off. That's a jog. You know, it's a light walk in the park. You then get to play Virtus Pro, who are now slipping down to 7th. I mean, this is the Virtus Pro who are clearly washed, but still cling on to relevance through these type of major runs where they upset, you know, double overtimes, as in, like, overtime in both maps to beat Astralis to get through to the semi in the first place. This is the Karrigan and Zonic standing in Astralis. Like, it's not a great team. They get to play them, but instead of them, they could have been playing, if you look at the other half of the bracket, could have been playing Liquid earlier. They could have been playing Na'Vi, who Liquid eliminated. They could have been playing Fnatic, that again, Liquid eliminated. And then for grand final, they play Liquid, who are, this isn't even the last Liquid they faced, which made more sense. This is the one with JDM and Simple. It's a really weak field as far as who they actually beat. And that's rough for your MVP ranking. The individual output, he's got a 0.89 KPR, slightly lower than his last MVP performance. A 1.38 rating. Ooh. Undeniable in the late round. I mean, I'm going to put him in the team effort section. A lot of that is going to be what they actually did. Like, in terms of the teams they beat and how ridiculously, like, performant the rest of the roster was. Yeah, coldzera benefited greatly from that squad in terms of, you know, his low DPR, how rampant they were. It was an impressive run for him still, but I think it's more of a team effort. I think there's a difficult case that you could make here for this to be the reality of our scenario. And I'm considering doing it just because of the numbers and because of his individual prowess. All right, we're going to do it. We're going to leave it like this. It does feel a bit more appropriate. When I compare in my mind, you see how I see that coldzera Luminosity MVP and how I see the Fnatic Olofmeister one, it makes more sense to have them on the same tier. It also makes more sense, even if the team was super helpful, and even if that in that solid MVP run, give him some credit. Judging Kjaerbye's MVP at the E-League Major in Atlanta is really tough. The majority of the reason he receives this MVP, I mean, sure, he's got good numbers throughout, but it comes down to that grand final. He's not the top performer in the quarters, nor the semis, but in the grand final, the man who should have been crowned, the man who should have received this medal, Device, chokes. It's not a new story. It's not a particularly interesting one either, but it's just the grim reality. Device for the entire event finishes with a 129 rating, but has back-to-back stinkers to close out that best of 3 that they win. Those 2 maps they win, he's not there. And that costs him. And that is a layup for Kjaerbye to come and, well, grab an MVP. It should have been Device's. To be fair, it's all Device's own fault. He should have played better. So how do we judge Kjaerbye? The numbers are good, far from impressive. In terms of the field especially, this might be the lowest KPR of anyone who's won the MVP so far. In terms of the opposition faced, there's some really impressive names, and there's one not so much. There's a Fnatic side from the Fnatic split. Remember when Fnatic became Fnatic and Godsent? Yeah, they played the Fnatic half of that in the semi-finals. The Disco Doplan Fnatic, which isn't great, but in the quarters they do face Simple's Na'Vi, the ESL1 New York champion Na'Vi, a real legit like title team. And in the grand final, they somehow Virtus.pro is still here, bro. Virtus.pro is still somehow here. It's absurd, like the fact that they still make this run. This is a part of what cements their legacy and keeps everyone just adoring this roster forever and ever. The fact they make this major final as well, they're this close to winning it as well. Absolutely insane in terms of championship metal. I mean, they're not supposed to be this good. Like, they're washed. Like, Taz and Neo just don't have it. Yet somehow they pull it out of the bag when it matters most. When it's the biggest event, somehow they just have that extra level to fight. And so it's a fairly respectable run. I mean, at this point, we have also switched to a Swiss system. It's a BO1 Swiss, and that leads to a fair bit of chaos. Some other sort of contending teams or important teams from the period, miss out through these best of one Swiss, including Optic. This might be the first MVP that goes in weak just because of his numbers. He wasn't even top rated on his team, top KPR on his team, let alone top in the event. I mean, Adren of Gambit ends with a higher rating. coldzera does. Fur is close. Snacks is higher rated than him. There's a case for a second place Snacks MVP if you want to make it. Like, that's where we're at. Still a major MVP. It's still a fantastic individual run, and the fact that he shows up in the grand final in that way, huge. Cements him as the youngest ever major MVP holder. Cements him as a legend who will be remembered forever, despite his brief career and transition into surfer dude. We all remember. I mean, it was all jokes. It's all jokes, but yeah, it's a strange one to judge correctly, and I'm sure there are people out there who are going to be vehement defenders of Kjaerbye's MVP, talking about the value of that game and would refuse to have him placed any lower than solid. But for me, it's just a weak MVP. I can make a very compelling, honestly, borderline just convincing, outright that Snacks should win this MVP from second place. As much as I hate really doing that, if it's not exceptional circumstances, like Snacks is only a 128. He's not that far above the field, but the case can be made. PGL now hosts the next major, and it's in Krakow, and it's weird. It's really weird. Gambit and Immortals play each other in the grand final. What the? Yes, so the MVP of the tournament ends up being Adren. It's a really odd tournament. It's a brilliant story in terms of the Gambit Zeus story. It's really interesting to see like this Immortal side show up and rock out, play fantastic CS with like these really talented individuals, but that would go on to be its own sort of PR nightmare. This is a really strange sort of period though as well for CS, as we got like the top teams are established, but at the same time they seem to be past, like they're not at their peaks. Like this SK has now got Phelps in for FNX, and it just doesn't work the same. They don't click in the same way. They still win a bunch of events, but at majors, they don't have the same dynamism that he brought to the table. FaZe are still figuring it out. They've got Keo and Alu. Like, they're not the final form of FaZe that would go on to be great. Like, they're still climbing that hill. And Astralis have, at this point, I believe there's already been some backroom conversations with the Kjaerbye leaving to join North. Some internal issues there. And the major ends up looking like that. It really does. And Gambit win after beating Fnatic, who are reunited, and it feels so good, but clearly just not the same people. I think this is, I'm not sure if this is pre or post Olofmeister injury. So remember, Olofmeister at some point does injure his forearm, and that kind of limits his play, and he doesn't really find his form until he's back on FaZe. There's a brief spurt. Like, this is a very neutered Fnatic relative to what we expect at a major. They play Astralis in the semi-final, huge semi-final. Like, that's a really tough opponent to face. As much as I've talked about, some of this set dressing in terms of the storylines brewing behind the scenes, they're still an incredible team, a title contender at this point. But in the grand final, play Immortals, who are not built for this title. I mean, the fact that Immortals are playing here is a shock in itself. They beat big. They upset Virtus Pro on the way through. You know, Virtus Pro took care of North. Astralis took care of SK. Like, there are some fortuitous circumstances for this win. And then the individual performance is not that crazy. I mean, it's a 0.8 KPR. It's great. He doesn't really maintain that throughout the playoffs, though. Like, in the playoffs, it's a real team effort type vibe. He's only top fragging or top rated even at one of the three series they play. It's the most important one. It's the Astralis one, but still, he's not exactly lapping the field. And in the grand final, you know, it's an epic sort of conclusion on Inferno. Train is always the map I remember the most from this era, just because it always popped up in the big games, and it was always kind of fun. But this Adren MVP is, if Kjaerbye's was weak, so is this one, unfortunately. Why can't I spot it? Did it not get added? Ta-da! Now he's appeared. Yeah, I know I made that graphic. I don't know where it went. But anyway, down in week. No Gambit logo, because I don't have anything open to remake the graphic. I'm just going to chuck him in there. I ain't got all day. A really fun run. And honestly, for me, the player I always remember the most from this event is Hobbit rather than Adren. But Adren ends up with the MVP. I mean, coldzera drops a 1.4 rating at this event. You know, it kind of puts this to shame. But no one who actually dominated in that way made the grand final. So it goes to Adren by default almost. Still a really impressive sort of performance, especially in the Swiss. Like, I think the Swiss is where he builds the majority of his rating. Historic, legacy defining for a player like Zeus especially. Speaking of historic, legacy defining, momentous occasions, all the other words you want to use, the next major is the one Cloud9 win. Yes, we all remember it. Boston major final. The one they win over Nico. Nico underperforms on map 3 of the grand final, and it's a whole thing. It's an important milestone in history. But let's talk about the player who wins MVP. Tarik, not famed for his intellect historically. Often excessively clowned. But realistically, this was a fairy tale run. This was a run that would never be repeated. And the team very swiftly disbands and breaks up. Like, it just, they knew it wasn't very real. You know, the worst rated player on this team at this event is Stewie at a 114. You know, it's a pure team effort in that sense. You know, you bottom at 114, you top out at 122 with your MVP. Like, this is just a pure team effort, vibes at the maximum, just rolling through. It's impressive, it's fun, it's pretty cool. I mean, loads of people look back on this as their favorite major of all time, and I understand them. You know, I have my own favorite majors. Doesn't matter that the entire event wasn't perfect and all this other stuff didn't happen. The players I love sometimes win, and that just does it for me, you know? In that sense, I understand why people love this one. In terms of what they did, you know, making it to the final, they face G2. This is the French G2 of Shox and Kenny S, a team I had a lot of excitement for, and the reason I bought a G2 jersey. But yeah, they take them down. They then play the SK, who are back on top of the world, #1 in the world. Even though it is the Phelps version, they were only just less successful at majors. They were still a fucking crazy good team. They beat them. And in the grand final, they play FaZe, the #2 team in the world. So in terms of difficulty, holy crap, they went through the ringer. Like, they played Shox and Kenny S. That's your easiest playoff matchup, Shox and Kenny S. Like, I get it, the duo never quite lived up to the hype that someone like me would have had for it. But Lord, that's difficult. And then you go and play tough series against the 2 best teams on the planet. That's an incredible run as far as difficulty. Now, unfortunately, Tarik isn't even top rated of any of these any of these series. He's really good in all of them, but he's never the guy. There isn't even a guy in some of them. Like, everyone's just kind of there, and that's reflected in the average ratings as well. It's just a team that won as a team, pure and proper. Rush had moments, Stewie had moments, Skadoodle had a grand final for be remembered, and in that speech, everything, you know, historic sort of moment, real incredible achievement. I wish I could go higher than team effort, but the individual brilliance part matters too much to me. And he wasn't individually that good. Like, he was, obviously he was good, but we're talking relative to this field, not that impressive. But at least the teams they played, holy crap. How did you win this major? All right, we now come to a fiasco of a major, a bit of a disaster. It felt like Astralis were going to win this without a sweat when we came into it, and that's what happened. And Device would win the MVP. They would take down FaZe Clan, Liquid, and Na'Vi along the way. 3 solid wins. Honestly, 3 wins that, when you look back on it, you're like, how did they make this look so easy? Because I remember watching it at the time and just being like, yeah, they're going to win the major. My pick'ems are solid. I'm good. They're going to win it. And then I went to the arena because this was in London. I go to the to Wembley Arena, and I just kind of watched them waltz through some opponents I thought had a chance, or that I thought would be interesting, or thought would be good. No, just brushed them aside. This was depressingly dominant as a team. Now, Device wins the MVP, but his numbers, again, we're talking back-to-back now events where the MVP is just the highest rating on his team, but not exactly bringing the house down. Again, an incredibly tough set of opponents. If you look at the ratings, not the ratings, the rankings coming into this event, the number 1 team, Astralis, faced in playoffs the number 4 team, then the number 3 team, then the number 2 team. It's as theoretically difficult as you could ever make a run, and it felt like they were walking through tissue paper. As an individual, doesn't separate from the pack at all. This is a team effort. Through and through, pure and proper, no two ways about it. And I'm leaving it there, but I'm casting my mind back, because I remember the grand final clearly, vividly. It was depressing and terrible, and the beer was too expensive. And Simple basically didn't exist. Simple at this point is the best player in the world. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Even HLTV finally get that right. But in the grand final, he's absent. And if he wasn't, it's a good chance he wins MVP with his 130-something rating, even with that dud final. But instead, he's just awful. I feel tempted to put it down to weak. But they played the number 4 team, the number 3 team, and the number 2 team. Like, how absurd. The next Astralis major would feature some of the same ideas, but also a few differences. Now, they would, again, tear through the playoffs and look fantastic as a team and have a bunch of different players averaging crazy numbers, but the level of opposition this time was very different. Instead of having to face the other top contenders, or top-ranked teams at least, back to back to back, some of them took care of themselves. They entered this event, of course, number 1 in the world, but they didn't face number 2. They didn't face number 3. They did face number 4 in the semi. They didn't face number 5. They faced number 6 in the quarter, and then faced number 9 in the world and Ents in the grand final. And if you think back to that time, the Ents run was fantastic, but it wasn't. They weren't a legit title-winning team in theory. The fact that they did upset Liquid, one of our better sides at the time, they did manage to get the upset against Na'Vi, another one of our supposed elite contenders. And that same Na'Vi had taken care of FaZe already. It did make things a lot easier for this Astralis team. They absolutely wrecked everyone they played anyway. And magisk ends up with the MVP with forgettable numbers. Forgettable numbers. There's no boost from the field as far as major MVPs go in terms of most valuable player. Bro, it could have gone to half the damn team. It could have gone to Device. It could have gone to ZipX. It could have gone to Dupree. This is a pretty weak one. Now, finally, the third win in the Astralis Major 3-peat comes at StarLadder Berlin. This one is kind of the best we have in terms of the Astralis Major MVPs, I reckon. Device ends up a clear gap ahead of his teammates. The obvious pick for once, it is him. He wins the MVP, and they face, on their way to that victory, they come into this one actually looking a little bit weaker than before. They're the 4th ranked team in the world. They do face Liquid, the number 1 team, and beat them in the quarterfinal. They then face the number 5 team in the world, NRG, a solid sort of title contender of this period, and beat them. Then in the grand final, they get their layup. They get their free win, pretty much. It's a Vanguard, the Jame-led side, one of their multiple excursions, way too deep in one of these events. And of course, Astralis take care of business. Device gets the MVP. I think this one has to go in solid. The numbers, they don't compare to the other solid MVP guys. Not quite. But it's not quite the team effort it once was as well. And they still faced some really deadly competition on the way through. And Device shone all throughout the playoffs. Now, one thing you could say, could demote this is, I guess, Vitality were taken care of by a Vanguard. The Vanguard they end up facing. And that's fair. That's valid. I just think this was, in terms of his performance through the playoffs, like, he just dumpstered everyone. This was the anti-choke. This was the perfect big event display from Device. And this was the major for him. This was a fantastic performance. And yeah, solid MVP. Not a top dog quite. Not a one-man army. But a really good showing. Now we have one of my favourite major MVPs ever. Unfortunately, it does come after 2 years of no major play, but in 2021, we return to majors, we return to Sweden, in Stockholm for the PGL Major. And this is the one Na'Vi finally win, but also Simple finally wins and takes the MVP for himself with a, just checks notes, 147 rating, a 0.95 KPR, an absolutely stupendous performance in the playoffs and overall, of course, across the entire event. This was one of the truly great runs. In their matchups, they end up facing up with Vitality, one of the top teams of the period, facing ZywOo. They then face Gambit with Shiro, with Axar, all these players playing some of their best CS, take care of them. In the grand final, played G2 with Nico and Hunter, who were ranked number 9 in the world coming into this, but we all know a Nico team. Like they were shockingly good. Nico had managed to get them to that grand final. Simple would outperform him. Simple would outperform him, outlast him overall, and get it done. He wasn't the top-rated player in every playoff series. He was second to a pretty impressive Perfecto in that quarterfinal. In terms of rating, like Perfecto shone in that one, but against Gambit, Simple was king. And in that grand final against G2, he was his best. So I'm going to have a really tough time deciding between Top Dog and One Man Army for this one. I've made my decision. I may have a slight bias towards Simple when I do this, but at the same time, he's the only player on his team who are stacked and loaded and all end up with fantastic ratings. He's the only one whose rating goes up in these playoffs. As it gets deeper, as it gets tougher, as they really have to grind it out and make it happen. OT win against that G2 side in the first map. Everyone else kind of fell short. Bit, had a fantastic group stage, but on stage wasn't the same. In the playoffs was not the same guy. Electronic also had a few more struggles. I think technically actually does Perfecto get slightly better in the playoffs? Yes, that's a lie. I did lie to you. Perfecto does get 0.04 rating points higher thanks to that quarterfinal, but most of his stats, if you notice from this period, are helped by the fact that he just doesn't have to die, ever. He doesn't have to do anything because he's got such ridiculous pieces ahead of him. Most importantly, the one-man army Simple. Absolutely dumpstering everyone. A 151 playoff rating. I mean, who the hell even does that? What are his fragging numbers like in the playoffs as well? A 0.99. Like, with that close from a 1.0 flat KPR for him in those playoffs. If that isn't the one-man army, I don't know who the hell is. So, Simple, ridiculous. This Na'Vi team, ridiculous by itself, but what a playoff run. Alright, back with the second part of this recording. It took me a while to get back to this. I've been busy. It's been awkward. But anyway, the next stage, the next major, the next MVP comes in Antwerp, and it was a legendary run in many ways, but realistically, we have to be analytical in the same way we have been for the others. We have to talk about Reign's MVP, and realistically, I'm going to say it one more time, realistically, as an MVP run, it's cool. It gets him on the HLTV top 20 single-handedly, saves his year, saves everything. He does end up the top-rated player of the major, but this isn't an abnormality. If you look at the major ratings from Antwerp, they peak at 1.24. This is just odd. Like, even going back to 1.0, JW's got a better rating than this, which is strange because, 1.0 threw out less extreme sort of peaks in most cases, really. But Reign, yeah, he doesn't top frag, I don't think, in KPR. No, KPR, he's not even top 5, but we top out at 0.81 with Spinks. It's just strange statistically as a major, just looking at the numbers that surround it. So technically he's top of the list, but he's not really separated himself from the pack in any meaningful way. The run that FaZe actually have is pretty diabolical until the grand final. Sure, they go 3-1 in the Swiss, but that doesn't include a loss to Ents, wins against Bad News Eagles, and Copenhagen Flames, and decided they do take on a Cloud9 in a best of 1. The best of 3s they actually play in the end are Copenhagen Flames, NIP, and Spirit. And this is Spirit with Patsy, with Dexter. It's not the same beast. They were expected to be in that grand final given their bracket. And then in the grand final they play Na'Vi, and it's an absolute stormer. Like, it's a great game. I remember being in the stadium for it, pretty fucking leathered, but still having a good time watching this CS. And he showed up. Like, that's the reason he gets the MVP. Sure, his semi-finals was a pretty big performance, but the grand final, he was immense. In that sense, it feels tough, because for a weak MVP, I'd expect him to not be the highest rated at the entire event. That feels a bit harsh to call it weak in that sense. Team effort also feels like a valid option, but he is still a bit ahead of those guys. It's going to feel weird, though, to have him in solid MVP with guys who, like, coldzera dropped like a 130 something in his MVP run, slaughtered a bunch of people. Pasha had a pretty cracked event too. I feel like he has to kind of go into team effort because he's not top rated in the quarterfinal. It's not a particularly statistically impressive event overall. You could probably put him towards the top end of team effort because he is, again, a step above. But that's a lot of advanced numbers stuff, like Brokey, Twists, Rops, all contribute quite heavily. Yeah, Rops has got a 0.7 KPR. Brokey has a 0.7 KPR. He's just the best of the bunch and has the biggest impact, has the biggest impact in the biggest game. It's a very, very solid MVP case. It's a fun case, but it's not, for me, in terms of the actual final result, a solid MVP. It's a de facto, almost. It would have been worse, but again, some of the guys in week, they were the best on their team, but not necessarily the best at the event. Rain does top the charts in that sense. I'll give him the team effort credit, but it's not that nuts. We then come to Rio, and probably one of the more, not necessarily controversial in terms of receiving the MVP, but just more complicated majors to talk about. It was a bad major in terms of how the playoffs actually ended up lining up, who played who, what games we actually saw. The top 4 teams in the world, FaZe, at this point, Na'Vi, Liquid, and who's the fourth? I'm always forgetting. Vitality, of course. Vitality at this point. 1, 2, 3 of them go out in the Swiss. 3 go out in the Swiss. And 1 goes out to Fury in a quarterfinal, which had its own problems. Outsiders end up beating Fnatic, Mouse, and Heroic to win the event. And also Heroic, you might eventually say that Heroic team becomes something better. We can also say they peaked in online play, and this is a far weaker side. I mean, they themselves only beating, again, the Patsy, wonderful addition of Spirit, and the furious side of Art, Drop, and Safe that just, aside from this blip, really didn't have the pedigree, didn't have that sort of title-winning aura. It was a very weak side. So Outsiders almost, it's not they default to the win. It's obviously a tough game. They have to go in and beat Heroic with a crowd that was pro-Heroic, if I'm not going crazy. I can't remember exactly. But it's not an impressive run. And for Jame himself, he's an interesting case to talk about because he's the AWPer of the team and the IGL. So talking about MVP case, in terms of most valuable player, for me, you do have to factor in the IGL of it all. When we talk about the end of year conversations about best players of the year, I do find it less interesting, less useful to talk about a player's in-game leadership, because at that point we're just talking about IGL of the year. We talk about that stuff separately. But here for MVP, the fact that he calls this team, a young team with inexperienced pieces, to a major win, whilst also being the highest rated amongst them. I mean, it's mostly because of rating 2.0 that he ends up the highest rated. Here's the lowest deaths, he saves a lot. Fame and Flit can be argued to be more impactful, more round winning. So in that sense, he isn't that impressive as an individual. He's a very strong individual. He's probably one of the, at worst, 3 best AWPers at this event in terms of actual play. In terms of rating, he's obviously number 2 behind Shiro. In terms of his ability to win games and his influence as just an AWPer, he was very strong. But his rating oversells him. It always has. It always did in 2.0 when you're talking back in those days. His ratings were always a little bit fraudulent for my liking. I didn't like the double dip of DPR and cast. I didn't like how AWPers could min-max the hell out of that to really inflate ratings. Jame has a lot of team help as well in terms of Flit and Fame. I mean, those two guys go absolutely ballistic in that grand final. Flit especially. In the semis, it is the Jame show a bit more. And in the quarters, it's back to what we expect with Flit and Fame actually leading the way. So it's a really tough MVP to assign, I'm sure, at the time on your HLTV. I mean, they probably want to put more faith into rating 2.0 than I always did. But at the same time, how do you separate? When you look at the playoff run, look at how great Flit played. You could have given this to Flit. I'm going to have to put it in weak, even with all the caveats that I've added of here's the IGL, he deserves a lot of credit for it. As an MVP, MVP case, it's tough. It's a really tough one to actually make just because as well of the bracket. Individually, not special, a really strong run, but not special. Has a lot of help from his team. And then on top of that, faces nobody of real significance. He doesn't face the top 4 teams in the playoffs on stage. It's a problem. It always feels harsh to mark down MVPs. Of course, we've talked about this many times in this video. I'm sure it's just the reality of his situation. Another major, another disappointing bracket. Yes, it's Blast Paris, the final major of CSGO. And when you look at the teams, just the teams who made the playoffs, you have Vitality, great. They end up winning. ZywOo gets the MVP. You have this heroic side who are super highly rated. Like, they're the number 1 team on HLTV ranking. But when you look back at what they achieved around this period, it feels a bit weak as a number 1. But they don't even play Vitality. You look at Vitality's run; they beat Into the Breach, Apex, and Gamer Legion. As many people joked, they won a CCT Cup for the major, which felt so disappointing. Individually, ZywOo is brilliant. He has a 0.89 KPR, a 1.39 rating. Like, he's really good. He's a full 0.15 ahead of Spinks, his running mate, his second star on his roster, and he doesn't really miss a beat. I think he's outperformed in the semi by Spinks, but in the quarterfinal, he's miles away from his team, and in the grand final, he's top again. He had a really good run, a very CT dominant run. If you remember looking back, his T-sides, this might have been the first glimpse we saw of the ZywOo T-side struggle. I mean, CS2 probably influenced it the most, but for this major run, he's not that impactful on the T-side, but the CT side's absolutely dominant. This can't be a weak MVP, unfortunately, even with the bracket. It's a weak run. It's a weak team event. I can't put it any other way. It's just a very weak run to the grand final and to the win. And they beat Game Legion, who at the time were 22nd in the world. And even though Game Legion, showed us some good stuff, upsetting Heroic, it didn't feel like a particularly sustainable thing. Now, some people insist otherwise. I know Ash has claimed, or he believes. I'm not saying he doesn't believe it. I'm not saying it's a fraudulent claim, just saying he believes, and not many other people agree with him, that this Game Legion side would have pressed on and done better things if given the opportunity. I have my doubts, but what matters is that is who Vitality played. For me, they weren't that great team. So, team effort, the labeling here is going to feel wrong, and solid MVP feels a bit too generous just given the competition. Yeah, I'm not going to let the name brand sort of sway me. I put Kenny S in team effort, and a lot of the guys in team effort have far worse stats than ZywOo does. But oh my god, that bracket is dreadful. So bad. I could put him at the top of team effort just for his individual numbers. His stats are great. He does top the entire event. He's really impactful in the halves, in the defensive halves especially, uniquely, especially. You've rarely seen that kind of dominance. But just look at the field, man. It's such a problem. There's a part of me that wants to put him in solid just because I have a slight bias towards the individual output compared to things like the bracket, but I'd be overlooking the bracket entirely to do that, because my god. We now make our way to Copenhagen for a major that would be honestly historic. I don't think there's ever been a team to win a major with less star power, not necessarily firepower, but star power, as far as big names and cemented legends, outside of perhaps Gambit, the Adren, Dosia, Mu, Zeus, Gambit. There's not a lot of major winners outside of Gambit outsiders who have as little star power as this Na'Vi that won the major. It feels strange to say, given that it is Na'Vi. We historically associate them with legends, big names, Simple, Guardian, Electronic, Edward, who was a huge 1.6 name. Early Go was also a very solid player. Legit superstars of Counter-Strike. This Na'Vi side had Blade as the coach, Alexi as the IGL, and then, aside from players who could potentially maybe one day be great, not a lot else going on. JL would take the MVP with a pretty standard-looking stat line for a team that wins an event and you're a good player on that team. Not a crazy sort of performance. 122 rating. There are 5 players with higher ratings than him across this event. 3 of them are Mouse players who go 3-0, then lose instantly to G2. Very small sample for them, just because they didn't make it very far. One's Munacy of G2, who they end up eliminating in the semi-final, and one is Donk of Spirit, who would go down to FaZe in the quarterfinals. This was not a great individual run. If you look at the playoff games they played, I mean, in their first one against Eternal Fire, we have a really standout, wonderful performance. JL's just really good. Next game they play, it's G2. That's the JL game. If you remember that game, this is the one with the Ancient, isn't it? Yeah, that Ancient, they end up winning 13-11, just edging past the Munacy, Hunter, Nico, G2. He's so clutch. People rip on Hooksy. a lot for his G2 time. The man won 3 big events, and he's JL deciding to be God away from making a major final here against a FaZe who probably weren't that awesome. Like, they were beatable. They had a ROPS overperformance, if I'm going crazy. Like, this is a... No, not ROPS. ROPS isn't on this team. Oh, he still is on this team. Who was popping off that shouldn't have been? I think it must have been the Brokey event or the Brokey rounds that I'm thinking of, where it's just like, this is not what you expect. This is not how you expect this sort of run to go. The team didn't make a lot of sense coming into it. You know, we had the whole conversation with ROPS and Frozen overlapping. They were the #1 team in the world, but it did feel like there were some issues brewing in FaZe. So yeah, that's not to question the validity of the run. Just in terms of the bracket they faced, Eternal Fire would go on to be a top team in modern CS. They were a difficult team to play always. Now in the playoffs, that's usually where we expect them to fall short, but still, it feels more legitimate than a CCT team. They then play G2, who are #5 in the world, but honestly, we watched that team play event after event. Sure, they'd often crash out, but they also win. They won 3 big events under Hooksy. They had a lot of firepower. They're dangerous. That's a legit opposition. Then FaZe were the #1 team. As much as I might, it might be my more recent bias painting my view of the ROPS Frozen duo. I did feel like we were already questioning it, but hey, they were the #1 team. They clearly had a lot of success prior to this. Well, they had won the major. This was this exact version of FaZe that won the major, wasn't it? In Antwerp. Or was that pre-Frozen? That was pre-Frozen, that was still Twist. Yeah, never mind. Yeah, there were these questions floating. But hey, they were the #1 team. That is a legit victory. But JL's statistical performance isn't that impressive. A massive bit in the grand final. Bit had some absurd infernos. This was around the time he became known for his inferno, really. Yeah, Na'Vi have the #1 current sort of major MVP. This is going to be a team effort MVP. I'm not going to put it down as weak, because even though his individual numbers are not that spectacular, the bracket's tough. The rounds he did win, insane. And his role in this roster was not to be hard set up. It was at times rather tough. He was sort of a 3rd or 4th man in that sense, where not everything's going to go your way. You'll have rounds, you'll have moments, you'll have maps, specific spots that are kind of suited to you, but generally you're just facilitating, making things work. And JL had some freak show rounds, some absolute freak show rounds that helped swing them this major. And that's why I have to give him at least the team effort. I don't think it's a weak MVP. When I watched the event, I came out of it thinking, as much as it is a bit grand final, a pop-off grand final from bit, JL's won one of the worthiest MVPs in terms of the impact he had. I think I'm a little bit blurry, am I? Yeah. So I have to give him that credit at least. Just by definition, the rounds he won were so difficult. Actually, we'll bump him up to solid. That immediately felt wrong. Leave him where he was. My gut says otherwise. There's a case for solid. Gonna leave him in team effort. We fly away from Europe now for Shanghai and the Spirit major win that somewhat shook the earth. They'd had a few okay results leading up this event, but nothing that indicated they'd be primed and ready to win it. And then we get one of the most incredible major runs from an individual we've ever seen. Donk goes crazy. He drops massive numbers, and he's able to get his team over the line. Grand final, he does have a freak step up from Magix, which is cool, but oversold. A lot of people talk as if that was just Magic's standard across the event. It wasn't. He ends the event, even with that grand final series of a 161, with an overall 116. It's meh. Overall, it's meh. So Spirit, for me, have the best... I think this is probably the best one-man army case ever. As far as the statistical dominance, he's a 145 rating, near 1.0 KPR, freak shit that only Donk does. And the roster with him are just... They're there to set him up. They're not there to really do a whole lot of fragging, and they didn't. Sometimes we talk about Shiro having a good performance and, coming along for the ride. He's fine at this event, but he's not a huge deal. And if you look in the playoff series they play, it's just Shiro's fine. Shiro's good against Mao's, and then in the grand final, Shiro's bad. So he has a real pop-off to win them that semi-final against Mal, where I think it's fair to say Donk actually chokes a little bit. But overall, it is the Donk show. It really is the Donk show. Honestly, in terms of where I'd rank him against Simple, is a bit more difficult, but Simple also has a series in his major run where he's not the top player in terms of his team's ratings and all that stuff. Like, he has a singular series where he's like second or third on the team, and Donk is quite far down in that series against Mouse, but all of that really stems from a pretty singularly terrible nuke map that brings his entire average down. The next two, he's back to being himself. It's not like he gets carried to the win. He just has a bad first map on nuke. 0.06 rating higher than ZywOo. And this is a part of the problem with this major run, is just the lack of top teams that Spirit face. If you want to make the case against him being in a one-man army tier, just on the basis of competition, you know, they face number 9 in the world Liquid, number 5 in the world Mouse, and then number 6 in the world FaZe. So none of the other top 5 teams, there's only 3 of them because Spirit are 4. So number 1, number 2, number 3 don't face them. But still, tough competition. Not the toughest, but tough competition. And an individual going absolutely bananas in a way that no one else ever has. Literally ever. So, Donk, congratulations, one-man army tier. Finally, the most recent major in Austin. Vitality win it, and ZywOo gets his second major MVP. And whilst there are some points of contention you can have with ZywOo's run, it is fantastic still. Now, over the course of the entire event, he is outperformed by Donk in terms of pure rating. Donk is a 140-something. I think ZywOo comes out to his classic, what, 138, 139? It's a 130... Yeah, it is an 8 this time. Yeah, 138. And it's a brilliant run, pretty similar to his last one in terms of KPR and all those other numbers. No real second star on his team stepping up to the same extent as well, so it is more of a singular carry job. The one problem you have when you talk about ZywOo and the Austin major run is that he smashes the quarterfinal, like takes Na'Vi down confidently, destroys Mao's, the number 2 team in the world. Again, level of competition really good. And then in the grand final against Mongols, who are number 5 in the world, he's kind of meh. He has a fantastic second map. That Dust 2 was impeccable. Basically, he won that second map himself, but Mirage, the map they lost, he's pretty absent. And then the Inferno that they end up closing out really isn't the ZywOo show. You know, Flamesy, Apex, both end up having massive grand finals, and so in that sense, it is tough to understand, like, really where you want to judge ZywOo on this one. He's somewhere between one-man army and top dog. And honestly, looking at the field in terms of who's in one-man army and what they did, and who's in top dog and what they did, I kind of feel like ZywOo has to be in the top dog tier. Now, this is the first event, well, one of the first events where we see a true sort of hybrid version of ZywOo. The version of ZywOo we've seen now, where he just doesn't AWP that much. Does a lot more rifling. Don't know how I did that. Especially on the T side, he's far more focused on getting his rifle out, you know, not forcing the AWP and just being effective. And that does help his rating a bit. I think he plays better in this one than we saw the last major on this T sides. But he's just a different beast. He's not the same player we were used to seeing in CSGO, but still hyper effective. I mean, his rifle is so damn good. He could be the best player in the world on a rifle if Donk didn't exist. So it's kind of awkward just because the best ratings he has this event are not in that playoff run. You know, he absolutely destroys Namiga in the Swiss. Has a disappointing game against Legacy, which gives a fuck. Crushes 3D Max in a best of 1, then absolutely crushes Virtus Pro in a best of 3. You see, it's a really, really impressive Swiss to get out, but then 1.44, 1.42, 1.13 sort of playoff run where I kind of have to deduct a point or two. I think if he'd gotten better as the major went on and not worse, we'd be having a very different conversation. We'd be talking about him in the one-man army tier, splitting hairs between him, Simple, and Donk. Unfortunately, not the case. That grand final is a red mark. It just has to be. Full credit to those guys who stepped up. Like, as there is an element of those players played so well, he didn't get the chance to. Especially on that final Inferno map. Like, Flamesy is so damn good. what is there for ZywOo to do? But he's 10 and 10, you know, even when he does get the chance, he's not shining. I think it's a fair rating. But let me know your thoughts. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Leave a comment to me your sort of changes you'd make, like who you'd have where. And yeah, remember to like, subscribe if you want more. And if you want access to the best demo review tool that I've ever used, strapbase.com. Use code KINGT when you sign up for 20% off your first month and support the channel. Yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.